Want to welcome you again to our session today. My name is Kelsey Schmitz, and I work for the University of Washington at the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, or the SMART Center. I'm the School Mental Health Director for the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and our center is located in Seattle. Our session today will be with you for an hour, and we're recording this session, and we'll be posting the recording in about 2 weeks. The link to the page where you can find the recording will be in the chat. We're trying something a little new by having QR codes, so you can also point your camera at that, and that'll take you directly to the page where the PowerPoint is posted, and the recording will be posted as well. So again, today's session is Managing Anxiety and the Return to School, part of that series that we started last year. And today we're going to focus on supporting students with anxiety in the classroom. So we want to take a moment for a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington SMART Center and the Northwest MHTTC acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We are grateful to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. So if this is not your first time joining us, then you know that we are part of the National Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network, which is funded by SAMHSA in late 2018. The MHTTC network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. We know that we do have many of you joining outside of our region, which we'll talk about in a minute, but want you to know that you have a regional center if you're in the United States. And you are welcome to check out your regional center. What's great about our network is you can take part in just about any of the other centers' activities. So we just invite you to visit the MHTTC network page and check out the great resources that are available. As part of the National Mental Health Technology Transfer Center network, our Northwest School Mental Health Center supports the school mental health workforce in Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And we invite you to reach out to us by connecting through email, through social media, through signing up for our listserv, or just regularly visiting our website for new information that we post frequently. And this is our disclaimer. Basically, SAMHSA sponsors this work, but does not reflect any official position on this content. All right, well, for those of you who have not joined us before, we're building on a series that started last year. We talked about identifying anxiety and what to do about it. We talked about managing anxiety during COVID. And then we had a session where we just couldn't get to all the questions from the first two sessions. So we just opened it up as a Q&A session. So those things have all been recorded. You're welcome to go back and watch the videos or access the PowerPoints and other materials on the link provided on the page. So today's presenters, again, we are very happy to have back with us Dr. Jen Blossom, who's a clinical child psychologist with expertise in assessment intervention for youth with anxiety, depression, and suicidality. Currently an assistant professor in the Division of Psychology and Human Development at the University of Maine, Farmington, teaching both undergraduate and graduate levels. And we are very excited to welcome back Dr. Kendra Reed, who's a clinical psychologist and the director of the Mood and Anxiety Program and director of anxiety programs at Seattle Children's. So welcome to Jennifer and Kendra. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much for the warm introduction, Kelsey. Great to see that there's a lot of new, I would say new faces, but unfortunately I can't see any of your faces. A lot of new names, and really excited to see that I'm not the sole East Coaster joining us today. Glad that you were able to hop on, even though it is early evening our time. So as Kelsey mentioned, we have some previous webinars that we were fortunate to join the MHTTC and provide, and this is kind of a review and update as we navigate the return to school with some continued challenges related to the COVID-19 pandemic and lingering effects of the past year. Kendra and I don't have any conflicts of interest or disclosures to share. Learning objectives. We just want you to be able to identify anxiety, distinguish typical anxiety from problematic anxiety, and then start to understand some specific strategies that you can support students using in the school setting. I won't read each of those in detail to you. You'll have access to these slides. So this is a bit of a review, and it looks, again, so thrilled to see that there are a lot of you that are joining us for the first time. So if this is feeling like there's not enough information, I will just point you towards our first recorded webinar where we go into this in a lot of detail. But just to review some of the key takeaway points that we had in our initial series, the focus of anxiety intervention is really driven by the fact that anxiety tells us to avoid situations, that avoidance is the only way that we're going to feel better, that we're going to be able to survive the situation, that we need to get out to stay safe. So with that in mind, the primary goal of anxiety intervention is to work on approaching the situation that makes us anxious. And we do that by finding manageable steps that kids can work on so that they are facing their fears rather than continuing to avoid those fears. And as kind of key stakeholders in these kids' lives, the things that we want to make sure that we're doing, we want to be checking in on our own anxiety in those situations. We want to make sure that we're providing support without providing excessive reassurance, because that can become avoidance in its own right. We don't want to provide distractions, because our goals are to have your students learn that they can face anxiety, that they can do things that make them anxious and be successful, even if they're still feeling anxious. And we also want to avoid any kinds of accommodations. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later in the presentation, but avoid any accommodations that are really promoting avoidance. So the key coping strategy that we're going to be talking about today is this, it's the process called exposure, which is facing your fears, practicing identifying the thing that makes you feel anxious and figuring out the steps to face those fears so you can be successful, and kids can do the things that they need to do and that they want to do. And one thing that, just to touch on briefly, we get a lot of questions about this. And again, point you towards our first webinar for a lot more detail about this. But there's been some mixed understanding. There's a lot of well-intentioned people who suggest strategies such as relaxation or journaling. And what the research tells us is that those strategies are actually not helpful in helping anxiety in the long term, and that in some cases they can actually be kind of confusing. So if we think about relaxation strategies, right, I was just describing that our goal for anxiety intervention is to have kids learn that even though I feel anxious, I can do the things I need to do or do the things I want to do. And if that's our goal, but then we're also saying, calm your body down, anxiety is dangerous, that's pretty confusing, especially for our younger kiddos. So what the research tells us, and what kind of cutting edge anxiety intervention tells us now, is that we really want to focus on identifying those gradual steps to face fears. And we don't necessarily want to spend time on these other relaxation strategies or coping strategies like journaling. So to kind of describe what this looks like in a little bit more detail, on the left side of the screen, you can see the cycle of avoidance, which is what anxiety drives, right? So a child encounters some kind of feared situation, like talking to somebody that they're not, that they don't know well, or needing to give a presentation in front of class. And when encountering that situation, anxiety starts to increase and the child avoids. So maybe they don't speak up in class, or they try to leave the situation, or they try to get some accommodation where they don't have to speak in front of the class. And often what we see is that well-intentioned adults, and these may be teachers, parents, caregivers, well-intentioned adults, see the child in distress and they want to make them feel better. So they comfort them or they help them avoid that situation. And then everybody notices that anxiety is lowered in the short term. The problem is that reinforces, that cycle really reinforces that the only way to deal with anxiety is to avoid the situation. If we think about kind of those early stages of not saying hi to somebody you don't know well, or avoiding needing to do some kind of task in school, that can start to really have a snowball effect, so that it's starting to really get in the way. And what we want to do is focus on a cycle of approach, as is outlined in on the right hand side of the screen here. And we want to help the child notice when they're feeling anxious in these feared situations. We want to come up with a plan. What's a step forward that they can take rather than a step back? And as part of that, the adult wants to provide validation. It's tricky, it's hard, and I know you can do it. So we want to avoid providing excessive reassurance. We want to avoid stepping in. This is when avoidance is okay, right? As the adults, we want to avoid providing too much reassurance, avoid stepping in and rescuing, instead providing that support, so that the child can take the steps to face their fear. And then over time, what the child will notice is anxiety might go down. The thing that they thought was really scary actually isn't that bad at all. Anxiety might stay the same, and they notice it, and they're noticing that they're also still able to do the activity or do the task that they thought that anxiety was telling them, no, 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 you can't do that at all. And then as really caring adults, we want to really reinforce that brave practice, really provide a lot of praise and a lot of excitement over the fact that the child took the step towards the thing that made them anxious, rather than providing that comfort when they've avoided the situation. And I'll pause here. And Kendra, you want to jump in?
All right, so just a couple of points about how COVID-19 has impacted our conceptualization here. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted youth mental health, right? Where their anxiety, especially anticipatory anxiety, is a common reaction in a crisis, right? Of course it is, because it's our body's system that readies you for objective threat. So in a global pandemic, this system is going to be activated. It makes complete sense. And we know that this pandemic has caused a lot of uncertainty and perceived loss of control. And while some things feel like they're approaching what was before, in terms of many children returning back to school in person, as one example, there are still lots of things that feel very different and changed, and we still don't know exactly what's around the corner. So that just continues. So this, as we think about anxiety, we want to think about all the different flavors of anxiety. So again, we use this ice cream metaphor. Makes me quite hungry, but sometimes what tends to happen is that when we conceptualize kids as anxious, we think of really the wallflowers, the kids that are shrinking back, hugging the wall, when really anxiety can come in lots of different flavors. As we break this down, I want to note that the key reason for doing this is so that we can expand the scope of what we're considering anxiety, but also recognizing that the intervention is the same regardless, right? So there are lots of different flavors, but we eat them all the same way. So the common themes that we see, especially within a global pandemic, but these were also common before, were worries about health and safety, either their own health and safety or the health and safety of loved ones, worries about separating from primary caregivers or other safety figures. Arguably, especially coming into this new school year, we've had less practice doing that in the last 15 plus months. So that has been harder. Increased worry about performance in social situations. Again, we've had less practice. Like, I have not been attending as many social situations. If I was to jump back into socializing the way that I was before the pandemic, I would feel pretty rusty and out of practice. And we're seeing that youth who are prone to anxiety are experiencing an increase in social anxiety. We see lots of worries about grades, doing well enough, or failure. And also a lot of worries about the unknown. And as we look for these flavors of anxiety, I just want to note the different ways that this presents itself. So we tend to see a lot of avoidance. And again, this can be overt avoidance. So just straight up not doing something, like not going to school, not talking, not completing homework, or it could be more subtle, right? So like overdoing a behavior in order to avoid a negative outcome. So over doing work in order to avoid potential failure or making a mistake, or over asking reassurance seeking questions in order to avoid uncertainty. We can also see a lot of complaints of body kind of reactions, or what we call somatic symptoms of anxiety. So the stomach aches, headaches, dizziness, shakiness. And again, this goes back to the fact that this emotion is tied to our entire nervous system, right? So we feel this emotion throughout our entire body. The purpose of anxiety, that fight or flight system, is to ready us to fight or run away to objective threat. So we're going to feel our entire body get ready to respond. And sometimes we're just not really thinking about emotions in that way, or we're confusing it for being sick, especially again within the context of a global pandemic. We also see sleeping difficulties, eating difficulties, inattention, and angry outbursts. And a note about the angry outbursts is that we just want to be thoughtful about understanding what's driving the behavior. Sometimes it's distress due to a different problem, like difficulty paying attention, but sometimes it's actually due to worry about failure when that isn't an expected outcome for a situation.
And jumping in here, Kendra, because what you're just describing is actually directly related to one of the questions that came up in our Q&A. So a scenario, a student's anxious about being in class, but uses cussing and defiance to get removed from the classroom. So it seems like you have a really strong conceptualization that the goal is avoidance. And Joe is wondering what to do when he's engaging, the student is engaging in these behaviors, and they understand the function is avoidance, but it's also making the rest of the class feel unsafe.
So I guess I would want to understand what factors of the classroom this student is trying to avoid, right? So is it the social situation? Is it the task demand of the work at hand? Because then we can design some exposures, some approach situations, as Jen noted, to help that child feel successful, help that student feel successful in approaching that situation, and feeding that plan into the classroom setting. So that is the information that I am missing in giving a clearer answer, but what I would recommend doing next for sure. Jen, would you add anything else there?
No, I think that's great.
Okay. And again, just going back to closing, I have to close the Q&A for a second so I can focus, but just going back to the impact of COVID-19, what we know is that there are different objective risks for different communities, right? So COVID-19 has impacted communities of color at much higher rates, both in terms of physical safety, right? Contracting COVID-19, but also in terms of the impacts on social determinants of health. So access to food, employment for caregivers, housing, stable housing. So so different communities have, again, different objective risks. So it's really important to consider this context when we're when we're addressing anxiety especially about COVID-19 for different youth. And we also just wanted to note that the mental health consequences of COVID-19 might be more common for youth of color. And currently, youth of color face greater barriers to treatment. So we knew that was happening before. There were greater inequities for youth of color in receiving evidence-based treatment. And these youth may be at greater risk now. So I just wanted to highlight these important points about equity here. So as we think about then how we approach exposure, that approach technique that Jen was describing, we want to think about a culturally and contextually responsive framework. So here's a little flow chart that Jen and myself and Nat Youngbluth, who's a psychologist in the Seattle area, that we put together for how to think about this. So just to describe what we have here, this is a decision tree, which helps us determine whether an exposure plan makes sense, quote unquote, or whether there's something else that we need to add into the plan in order to have this be an appropriate plan. So this might be, so the first question is this fear realistic? Is it likely to happen in my life? If the answer is no, then we can go to a straight exposure plan. If the answer is yes, this fear is likely to happen, then we want to ask a follow-up question is like, is this something that a youth should know how to deal with? If the answer to that is yes, then okay, let's think about whether or not there are any additional things we need to add to the situation to help a youth be successful and safe in approaching this fear. So a good example of this sort of situation is bullying. So is it realistic that my child's going to experience bullying, or that I might experience bullying in this setting? If the answer is yes, and like I'm still going to need to know how to deal with social situations, then let's go to the next bullet point of how do we make sure, what are other interventions that we need to make sure are in place to make this situation safe while then also doing exposures to social situations, so that our children can learn how to approach those. Jen, I've been trying to think of a really good example for a likely fear that a child should not know how to face. What's your good example for that?
Good question. Way to put me on the spot here, Kendra. I think, relevant to the last slide that we were talking about, thinking about inequity, for example, one of the things that we want to be culturally considerate of is issues around discrimination and bias and situations where people, right, that first question, is the fear realistic? That is from the child and family's perspective. So as culturally responsive individuals supporting the child in this perspective, we need to understand their lived experience. And if the situation, for example, is discrimination, we don't need children practicing facing discrimination, right? We should be joined in supporting eradicating that type of experience from a child's life. So that would not be a point where we need to practice an exposure and have people say hateful things, right? That's hopefully an extreme example, but something that is a situation in which exposure is not indicated. There's also exposures that or situations, right, where we're thinking about where physical safety might be a concern. So for children who have separation anxiety, right, they might worry about their physical safety or the physical safety of their caregivers when they're away from them. When that comes up and they're at school, they're at daycare, right, we have evidence to suggest that they should be in a setting that is safe, and that's where we might want to practice some exposure. That doesn't mean having, a 5-year-old practice being home alone for an hour, right? Because that would be a situation where they might be unsafe. So it's finding the developmentally typical expectations for the child and understanding it within that context. Does that kind of answer your question, Kendra? Or are there other things that came to mind?
Yeah,
as I was?
I just, being full disclosure, everyone, in case you hear him in the background, I'm home with a baby who's got the pukes. So my brain isn't coming up with great examples off the cuff. So thanks, Jen, for the assist. So given the overwhelming number of kids who are experiencing anxiety within this context, we want to think about integrating care, like thinking of brief anxiety intervention in settings that youth typically frequent, like school, which so I'm so glad to be talking with all of you today. We're also thinking about primary care offices and other places, but arguably students are with you way more than they go to their primary care doctor. So if we can think about how to integrate these skills into the settings that youth already frequent, then we are able to reach more students and catch things earlier in order to prevent things from worsening. So there are many, many, many naturally occurring opportunities for facing fears in the school setting, and we're happy to help brainstorm about that. So just to help us brainstorm some different ways that we can face fears, Jen and I put together a table of some different ideas that come up frequently. So sometimes, the fear is negative evaluation by others. So the exposures that we're practicing are being on camera, like right now, making a mistake in a social setting, or drawing attention to yourself in a social setting. So this might be, we've done all sorts of things in person and virtually. So in person, we might be like walking around the hallway with like a stack of my heavy books for my office, and we might drop them in front of open offices. Or, in the grocery store, you drop something that is not breakable, like a box of cereal or something like that, when somebody else is in the aisle with you. Or we have crab walked around the hospital or gone into the lobby and sung happy birthday at the top of our lungs. Just something that would draw attention and would kind of be unusual in order to say like, hey, what is the worst thing that could happen in this situation?
And this relates to one of our questions that came in the Q&A, related to the comment about journaling and thinking about it specifically from an REBT perspective, where the goal is identifying the thought and challenging it. Mm-hmm. And so in that case, the way that I would think about that, right, is instead of perhaps having that be a journaling activity, that first step is really highlighting what Kendra was just describing, where we want to understand what is the feared outcome. Because that's how we can make sure that we are developing or identifying a really targeted exposure practice. And then in the case of challenging, instead of using kind of typical cognitive strategies, which tend to be less effective, particularly for younger children, and in general, again, exposure really drives change in anxiety and functioning rather than cognitive restructuring. The challenging component of that practice is the exposure, right? So we've identified the feared outcome that I'm gonna, walk to the front of the class to start my presentation and everybody's gonna laugh at me. And then we use that information to challenge that. And we challenge that the feared outcome either won't happen, or that if it does happen, you can actually handle it better than you thought you could.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that actually by virtue of doing the exposure, it's another way of provide that new learning opens up the possibility of different ways of thinking of a situation, of like, hey, what actually happens, which tends to be a more effective way of like truly considering alternative possibilities, different thoughts or perspectives than without that lived experience. So for separation anxiety, we practice separating, sitting independently in a seat, having a parent step out of the room. For kids that are old enough and able enough, having parents staying home for bits of time without their parent there. And we can think of what this would look like in a school setting. Sometimes just going to school is the separation anxiety exposure, and we can see a lot of school avoidance behaviors resulting from that core fear of separating. For fear of making mistakes, we practice making them, because we're human, and I probably made 17 already in this last, 30 minutes. So we answer questions wrong on purpose. We ask hard questions. Sometimes I'll give like SAT level spelling words to third graders just to say like, let's see what happens. What happens if you get it wrong? So that it, not that to encourage like frequent mistakes, but just to say like, when we ultimately make mistakes as human beings, then it's not so shocking or terrible. And then for fear of physical symptoms of anxiety, we face those physical symptoms. So if it's like, oh, but what if I'm just going to feel nauseated, or I'm going to like feel really hot, or my heart's going to beat fast, I just can't tolerate that. We do then kind of do physical activity to bring about those symptoms and practice riding the wave of those symptoms themselves. So spinning in a chair, doing jumping jacks, running up and down stairs, breathing through a straw, different things like that. Okay. And when we think about supporting students with anxiety in the classroom, again, the best practice to encourage is approach over avoidance over time. So what teachers and other school-based professionals can do is work with families to identify what those goals are, offer opportunities for exposure, track and find ways to praise and give a lot of attention to those brave behaviors and track progress. So this is where using a school to home note, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, can certainly apply for anxiety, where we're setting specific goals of saying, whispering to a teacher 3 times, or just sitting in your chair in math class, and every 5 minutes that you sit there and tolerate the anxiety of math class, we're giving you a point, or whatever it is. We're practicing breaking it down to the steps and positively reinforcing that. The key is this combination of validation and confidence in how you communicate your support to youth with anxiety. So it's the I know it's hard and I know you can do it combination. Okay, Jen, passing it back over to you.
So there's a question that came up just generally about exposure, about the potential of having the opposite effect, that by asking kids to approach these situations that we might be increasing anxiety. And certainly that may happen. And again, we are thinking about it, and that's why we showed those cycles at the beginning, is that anxiety may increase in the short term. And what exposure is doing is really teaching students, teaching kids about how to manage and handle anxiety. So anxiety has taught them the only way that you can manage this is by leaving. And what we want to help them learn is that I feel anxious and I can actually still manage. So even if anxiety increases, as long as they're participating, they're taking steps forward, they're doing the thing that feels hard and challenging, then we're helping them relearn, right? Learn that I can feel anxious and I can still do it. So even when that happens, that's not necessarily going against our strategies or going against our goals, because when we think about the big picture, the long term, we haven't set up a practice where they've learned that avoidance is the only way to handle it. So anxiety might increase in the short term, but in the long term, we would actually be helping reduce it or help them see that they can do the thing that's hard.
I think that's a good point, Jennifer. And I think just noting that the point of doing exposures is to bring about anxiety. We need to experience anxiety in those situations to have a new learning experience. If we experience no anxiety in a situation, then there's unlikely to be new learning. So it's the very confusing, it seems counterintuitive part of our jobs, is that we make anxious kids anxious on purpose all day long in order to help them feel less anxious in the long run. Okay, Jen, so just to finish up this one slide, I guess, and then I'll hand it over to you, Jen. This is the school to home note example that I was talking about. I'm sure all of you or many of you may have different formats that you use, but it can be as simple as a scrap piece of paper with some check boxes on it. It doesn't have to be as fancy as this.
So this, we've kind of referenced this earlier, and is definitely coming up in a lot of the questions that many of you have commented on, and Kendra and I hear frequently. One of the challenges in the school setting is that formalized accommodations, either through 504 or IEP, often include contraindicated suggestions like extra time to complete assignments or to take a test, avoiding calling on the student, other strategies that ultimately facilitate avoidance. And hopefully, as you've heard and are starting to see, that's really not helpful in the big picture, not helpful in getting kids doing the things that they want or need to be doing. So one of our recommendations and goals is really, as Kendra was just describing, through a similar process as the note that you might send home, but really making sure that there's strong communication across all parties involved. So oftentimes, I know when Kendra and I are working with students where this is coming up a lot in school, we'll have direct conversations with teachers, we'll have conversations with people involved in the 504 IEP plan, and we want to help identify steps that you might be able to take to that actually facilitate that approach. So one question that I'd actually answered by typing, but is certainly relevant here, a question that came up was about if students are worried about speaking in front of giving a presentation in front of class, might an accommodation that still fits with our goal of approach versus avoidance, using leveraging extra time. So students given advance notice that the presentation is coming up, And then in that time before the presentation, where they're standing in front of the class talking about their topic, we've identified the steps that they're going to do so that they're successful in doing it on that day. So rather than it being, everybody has a month for this presentation and this student gets 2 months, we would say everybody has a month for this presentation. And in that month, the student's going to practice presenting. They're going to present to their stuffed animals. They're going to present to their parents. They're going to record themselves presenting and then play it for their teacher. Then they're going to play it for their teacher while they're standing there. So they have to hear their own voice being presented in front of their teacher. And then they're going to give a live presentation to somebody at school. So using that time to actually identify what are those steps that they could be working towards to approach rather than to avoid. So really thinking this tends to be a pretty significant shift compared to the accommodations that we typically see in these plans. And our hope and our goal in providing these presentations is just to empower and support more of the people who are closely working with these students, who really care about students' success and well-being, in being able to shift this strategy so that we can really be identifying and supporting students who are potentially having anxiety be more often accommodated than we would like. So I'm seeing a couple of questions that have come up in the chat, or rather in the Q&A, that are potentially relevant. So the one actually that I just have my eye on looks like maybe Kendra just answered by typing. Our heads are just constantly, we think very similarly. So questions coming up, right? Exposures can be tricky. Oftentimes we're asking kids or adolescents to do things that are hard, and it can be challenging. We can start to see potentially defiance, or we can see it's really challenging to get any kind of movement. And this is where we want to think about all those great behavioral strategies that you might be using to help support your students manage classrooms in general. So setting up potential reinforcement or incentive for their ability to participate in these practices. So if they have times that there may be, if they meet a goal in school or meet a task and they're able to, work on coloring or work on drawing or doing some activity that they enjoy doing because they completed the assignment that was needed, figuring out how you can use similar strategies like that to support their practice in the school setting. Kendra, I'm curious if there were other questions that you were noting that you wanted to jump in and respond to here, since we're just also to share with everybody, we are officially in the kind of question and answer. So really appreciate that everybody's been popping in with questions as they've been coming up. But for the remainder of our time together, we are happy to continue answering your questions.
There's a question I was just typing an answer to, and I'm just going to delete that and answer it live, about the distinction between relaxation and mindfulness, because mindfulness does have some evidence in reducing anxiety. And I would say that relaxation and mindfulness are different. So mindfulness would be awareness. The way I would define that is awareness without judgment. And relaxation is an active effort to reduce a level of anxiety or distress, which to me implies a judgment about it, that implies that feeling needs to be changed. So we actually use mindfulness all the time while we're doing exposures. So we gather what are called SUDs, or subjective units of distress, which are ratings of how anxious someone feels from 0 to 10. That's one way. And we also make some other observations about what it feels like to do these exposures. So as youth are riding the wave of anxiety and doing exposures, we want to build their awareness of what they're experiencing. And we want to try to remove as much judgment from that as possible. So just like, wow, you're at an 8 anxious. You're noticing that feeling in your stomach, right? And also, look at what you're able to do in this moment. You're still here. You're taking this brave step. Just to note that we can still be functional and productive, even at high levels of anxiety. and maybe productive is the wrong word, we can still be functional, we can still do well. And the more that we stay in the situation and have that new learning experience of like, hey, I actually did this, or hey, that bad thing I was worried about, that never happened. Then we see that the magnitude of that wave of anxiety decreases over time. Jen, was there a question you wanted to answer next?
Yeah, one question that came up, somebody who really wants to be able to support students and also has a lot of students, so 200 plus students, and thinking about how do I implement some of these strategies when kind of an individual approach might not be as realistic. So a couple of ideas that I have, and then would love to hear any additional ideas you might have, Kendra. First of all, kind of sharing this information, right? The more that people can understand how this process works, the better. Particularly, I think that person shared that they have 7th and 8th grade students. So that's a good age to kind of just start to describe and provide some of this psychoeducation. So understanding what anxiety looks like and what we want to do about it, and having that conversation with them and providing that information. Another piece that comes to mind is sharing how you might have implemented these strategies. So again, you're modeling the adaptive coping, you're modeling facing fears by sharing your own experience taking these steps. And that can be really impactful for students. Again, it allows you to kind of share that information and provide a type of intervention even when a one-on-one approach might not be as realistic. Kendra, I'm wondering if you have any other ideas for how to promote this with
yeah, and it dovetails with another question of like, how do we make this shift in a huge school context where there are schools of like 700 plus, like how can we do exposures for every single kid? And really I want to think about like, what are the functional steps that we're asking them to do as part of school anyway, and how can we positively reinforce approach rather than avoidance? So it becomes part of our message or part of our vernacular of like, gosh, I know it's hard. This can be super anxiety provoking to stand up here and give this presentation class. And I know you all can do it. And then as you see that youth are struggling, rather than having them step away from it entirely, helping them find just half steps back where they can still be successful, but you're not removing the expectation entirely. That also sends a message to every other student in the classroom who might be experiencing something similar about how, like, actually we can do this, how to find some steps forward. So just want to put that out there, that we really weave exposures into what's functionally happening, what has to happen as part of everyday life anyway. So we can get really creative. So it doesn't have to require a lot of like extra, like every teacher has to do like an extra hour of exposure with every kid per day, because like that would just be nonsense. We'd have to be inventing time for the day. So we really want to weave it into everyday life and have, I think, just the shift be more in how we talk about anxiety, normalizing it, normalizing approach rather than avoidance.
So one question that I'm seeing that again commonly comes up is around pushback from parents when we make suggestions about of shifting this focus. So we want to focus on approach versus avoidance. And one of the strategies that even just through conversations with community partners is really one of the ways that I've kind of shifted my language around this. And one of the things that I notice that people tend to get caught up on is, well, if somebody's anxious, they need coping skills. They need coping skills. And there's very narrow view of what coping skills are in this case. They tend to be right time away. They need time to decompress. They need relaxation. They need that time for journaling. And that's where I've shifted my focus. And even, starting at the beginning of our conversation today, of really framing approach as a coping skill. And it truly is, because when we feel anxious and we feel like we're not going to be able to manage in a situation, it can be really hard to identify what are the steps that I need to do. So what we want to help support students in doing is identifying what are those steps that I can take. Noticing when you're starting to feel anxious and noticing and catching that early and then taking steps forward is a skill. It's part of adaptive emotion regulation. And that's really what this what we're hoping to do, and what you might be able to do from a more of a prevention approach when students are noticing this earlier on. So sometimes shifting that language can be helpful, because again, I think that it tends to be almost a definitional issue that can be challenging, or thinking about that coping really needs to be, really is this avoidance approach, but not to be confusing with approach, but really thinking about how we can kind of shift that strategy. And as part of having those conversations with parents, again, validating how hard it is to see your child in distress, and helping remind them of the big picture too, right? As we age and we face different challenges, there's going to be times and situations where we don't know what to expect, or where things are going to be harder than we thought. And what our goals are for your child, for our students, is that they'll have the skills to be able to navigate those situations and handle that uncertainty, or handle things that are difficult and challenging. And that this approach, right, this coping skill, exposure, is the way to do that. Anything you might add there, Kendra?
Yeah, I was just going to say, thanks, Jen. I think that's actually answering, or I hope that that's answering several of the questions that we're getting about, like, how do we frame this to parents, where that might be the real shift. I think there might be, I just want to also clarify, when we think about 504, changing or adjusting 504 plans, we're not, or IEPs, we're not suggesting that we remove all supports for youth with anxiety, right? Because honestly, especially when youth are really struggling, they might need some more supports. We just want to be really thoughtful about what things are helpful versus what things are distractions, right? So I've seen a lot of well-meaning, compassionate people spend a lot of time providing a lot of resources to kids with the aim of helping them with anxiety, but ultimately those things weren't getting anybody anywhere, right? We needed to use different strategies. And so that would mean, so I'd want to rephrase a 504 plan or an IEP that's geared toward approach. So what are the steps that we're going to take together to move from, for example, a child who's not speaking at all at school, to from not speaking at all to then whispering one-on-one with the teacher, then low volume with a teacher, and then whispering with a peer, and then low volume, all the way up to giving that presentation in front of the class, because that's an expectation and something, a place for this child to grow, or being able to ask for help or ask to go to the bathroom, right? So we want the wording in 504 plans and IEPs to reflect that approach strategy, versus like, don't call on this student, or don't ask them to share, or, remove them from music class entirely, because that sort of full avoidance without a plan to eventually approach would be essentially just colluding with anxiety and agreeing that, like, yeah, my kid can't handle this, when I honestly don't think that that's true. Anxiety is not a lifetime disorder, and it's something that we expect to change over time. We see from research repeatedly that we see the majority of youth, their anxiety symptoms and anxiety disorder diagnoses remit within even 4 months' time. So it's something that is changeable, and we would just want our school-based plans to reflect that dynamic.
Another question I'm seeing is managing, supporting students who report somatic symptoms that seem to be anxiety driven. And so without knowing more details there, a couple of ideas that you might think about is that might be the mindfulness, right, of helping them identify that that's what anxiety feels like in their body, and notice when it's happening and what they can do to continue approaching or engaging in the situation, even if they notice pain in some area, or if they notice that their stomach is kind of feeling, it's gargling, there's some butterflies. So commenting and observing those somatic symptoms while they're still engaging in the situation that feels challenging. Sometimes anxiety tells us that those somatic symptoms are dangerous themselves, right? So it's the fact that my stomach feels a little upset, or it's the fact that I notice that I'm a little out of breath, that's dangerous and that's scary. And we can practice facing those fears by bringing on those sensations. So doing strategies similar that might be in a part of a physical education class, if a student is able and in a situation to be able to do that. So bringing on kind of that out of breath feeling by maybe doing jumping jacks or moving in place quickly, and noticing that having those feelings and noticing that the feared outcome isn't actually happening. So a couple of strategies that you might be able to do there. Any other questions that are coming up that you're noticing, Kendra?
I'm having an executive functioning challenge of reading fast enough. So I'm just going to read one out loud and do my best. Would love tips on where to access research on using approach rather than avoidance to reduce anxieties. My district would want me to have data on hand. Yeah, Kim. So to your point, cognitive behavioral therapy is the overarching term that we're looking for. So cognitive CBT with exposures. So if you want to look for that, all of the evidence-based interventions, and Jen looks like she has some additional resources to send your way, would reflect everything that we're saying here. And Jen might have some specific resources. I know that John Comer was writing, I don't know if it's come out yet, a paper about school-based accommodations for anxiety and what things are evidence-based versus what things are not. So hopefully that's come out. We will look it up too. Okay, let's see.
So I think that is probably a really good transition for wrapping our session up today, talking about resources. Moving forward, one of the things that Jen and Kendra will be working on is a toolkit for us, and which will include a lot of different resources, some of the material, some of the things you've seen today, some of the things from other sessions, but really putting this together in a package that you can take and use or take back to your school or take and share with teachers or others in your community. And we'll bring them back on to talk about the toolkit in the spring, as well as address any additional questions that maybe we haven't gotten to today or that come in after this session. And then coming in January, we have a series on leading with youth voice. So save the dates. We'll have some information up on our website soon for those two sessions. And then finally, this is just how you can reach out to us and to our team and let us know what your support needs are, information that you're looking for, resources that you need, or other ways that we can support your school mental health efforts. And so with that, I am going to wrap up this webinar. Thank you to participants who were on today. Thank you again to Jen and Kendra. Thank you to Jen and Natalie and Rayanne from our team who've been working behind the scenes. You, Jen and Kendra, always great information. Super impressed with your ability to answer all the Q&A. I think we were like 30 questions or more. So thank you for working through as many of those as you could, and hope everybody has a great rest of their evening.